Your soulmate paid a psychic to make you disappear from their mind. Not because they hated you. Not because the feelings were gone. They were terrified of one simple truth. They still loved you. They had tried everything they could think of. They deleted your pictures. They removed old conversations. They avoided places that reminded them of you. They stayed surrounded by people so they wouldn't have to sit alone with their thoughts. Nothing worked. Your memory kept returning. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It appeared in the smallest moments. A song. A familiar expression. A place you once visited together. A random sentence that sounded exactly like something you used to say. And every time it happened, they felt the same ache. So eventually, they made a decision. They would pay someone to help them forget. They found a psychic. They booked a private session. And when they entered the room, they brought only one thing with them. Your photograph. The psychic looked at it. She didn't touch it. She simply stared. Then she looked at them. Why do you want this person erased? They answered immediately. Because I can't move on. The psychic tilted her head. That's not the real reason. They became uncomfortable. What do you mean? You don't want to forget them. She pointed toward the photograph. You want to forget what you became when you loved them. Silence. That sentence went straight through every defense they had built. They looked away. The psychic waited. Finally, they whispered, I just want peace. Then tell me what happened. They gave her the simple version. The relationship became complicated. Arguments started. Communication broke down. Distance appeared. Eventually, they separated. The story sounded ordinary. The psychic wasn't convinced. She asked, who ended it? They hesitated. I did. Did you want to? Another pause. No, then why? They looked at the photograph. Because the real answer was difficult. They were scared. You had become too important. You noticed things nobody else noticed. You could tell when something was wrong even when they insisted everything was fine. You saw through their confidence. You recognized their insecurities. You knew when their smile was forced. And instead of making them feel powerful, being understood made them vulnerable. They didn't know how to handle that. So they created distance. They became colder. They answered less. They stopped explaining themselves. They thought if they pushed you away first, they wouldn't have to experience the pain of being abandoned later. But you noticed. Of course you noticed. You asked what had changed. They didn't tell you. You tried again. Still nothing. Eventually, you stopped asking. That was the moment they never expected. They thought your silence would make things easier. Instead, it became the loudest thing in their life. Jesus speaks to the heart that has been hurt by someone else's fear, my child, do not mistake another person's inability to love openly for a reflection of your worth. Sometimes a heart runs from the very thing it secretly prayed to find. They remembered the last serious conversation between you. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. You wanted to know where you stood. You wanted their words and actions to match. They could have told you the truth. They could have admitted they were afraid. They could have said, I care about you more than I know how to handle. Instead, they chose the easier answer. I don't know what I want. You believed them. And you stepped back. They didn't realize that your retreat would become permanent. At first, they felt relieved. No more pressure. No more difficult conversations. No more emotional decisions. Then the days passed. They began missing you. They ignored it. More time passed. The feeling became stronger. They tried distracting themselves. Work. Friends. New routines. New conversations. Nothing reached the place you had occupied. One night, they opened an old photograph. Your face appeared on the screen. They stared at it longer than they intended. Then they whispered, "Why can't I forget you?" That question became the beginning of everything. Because they weren't only missing you. They were missing the person they had been around you. The version of themselves that laughed more freely. The version that could speak honestly. The version that didn't have to pretend to be strong every second. That frightened them. So they searched for someone who could help. That's how they ended up in the psychic's room. She shuffled the cards. Once. Twice. Then stopped. She looked at them. "I need you to answer something honestly." "What? Did someone influence you before you walked away?" Their expression changed. They immediately thought of a particular person. Someone they trusted. Someone who had repeatedly warned them about you. Someone who always seemed concerned. "You're thinking of someone." They nodded. "What did they tell you?" They remembered the words. "Be careful. Don't get too attached. You don't really know this person. Something about them doesn't feel right." At the time, those warnings had sounded protective. Now they sounded suspicious. The psychic asked, "Did you begin doubting this relationship after those conversations?" "Yes." "Did your behavior change afterward?" "Yes." "Did that person ever tell you to leave?" They hesitated. "Yes." The psychic placed the cards down. "Then your story isn't only about heartbreak." Their breathing changed. "What is it about?" "Influence." That word stayed in the room. They stared at her. "You're saying someone caused the breakup?" "No," she shook her head. "I'm saying you need to discover how much of your decision was actually yours." They looked down. That question hurt. Because they had always believed they had made the decision alone. Now they weren't sure. The psychic turned over the first card. Then another. Her expression became serious. "There is something you don't know." "What?" "I see a hidden conversation." Their heart began racing. "With whom?" "Someone close to you." "What did they say?" "I can't see the exact words." She paused. "But I can see the intention." "What intention?" "To make you doubt this person." They immediately reached for their phone. Old conversations. Old messages. Months of history. They searched. Nothing. Then they found a conversation they had forgotten. The person had sent several messages around the exact time you two began falling apart. The first was ordinary. The second was strange. The third made their stomach drop. "Don't tell them I warned you." They stared at the screen. They read it again. Then showed the psychic. She didn't look surprised. Instead, she asked, "Did you ever ask what they meant?" "No, why not?" "Because I trusted them." The psychic's voice became quieter. "Trust is valuable. But trust without discernment can become dangerous. Archangel Michael speaks, my child, do not fear the truth simply because it may disturb the story you believed. What is hidden can only control you while it remains hidden. Seek clarity. Do not build your future upon assumptions." They continued scrolling. There was another message. Deleted. Another. Missing. Then a final message appeared. If you stay with them, you will eventually learn why this connection was never supposed to happen. Their heart stopped. They looked at the psychic. What does that mean? She stared at the screen. I don't know yet. You're the psychic. I can recognize a pattern. I cannot invent the missing pieces. They swallowed. What should I do? Find out why that person was so determined to keep you apart. They wanted to call immediately. The psychic stopped them. Don't. Why? Because whoever sent these messages may not know what you've discovered. And? Let them believe you still know nothing. That advice changed everything. For the first time, they weren't thinking about forgetting you. They were thinking about the truth. Who had influenced them? What had been hidden? Why was someone so determined to make them distrust you? And what did that strange message mean when it said your connection was never supposed to happen? The psychic picked up your photograph. She turned it over. There was nothing written on the back. Then she looked at the date of birth written on their intake form. Her expression suddenly changed. What? She didn't answer. She looked at the date again. Then at your photograph. Then back at the cards. You need to come back tomorrow. Their heart sank. Why? Because I don't want to tell you something tonight that I can't explain. What did you see? She remained silent. They stood. Please. The psychic finally spoke. I saw your name connected to something that happened before you ever met this person. They froze. What kind of connection? I don't know yet. She placed the photograph back on the table. But one thing is clear. What? This story didn't begin when you met. They stared at her. The room suddenly felt colder. Because if she was right, then the relationship they thought was a random encounter had a history neither of them knew. And the person who had tried to make them forget you, may have known about that history all along. The psychic looked directly into their eyes. Come back tomorrow. They walked toward the door. Then she called them back. One more thing. They turned. Don't contact this person yet. Why? Because if they realize you're asking questions, she paused. They may try to destroy the evidence. And that was the moment the request to forget you became something much bigger. They had entered the room wanting your memory erased. They were leaving with a completely different question. Who had been trying to erase the truth? And why? The next morning, they returned to the psychic. They hadn't slept. The message was still on their phone. If you stay with them, you will eventually learn why this connection was never supposed to happen. One sentence. Yet it had opened 100 questions. The psychic was already waiting. There was no greeting. No small talk. She simply pointed toward the chair. Sit down. They sat. She placed the same photograph on the table. Your photograph. Then she placed a second object beside it. An old envelope. You didn't give me this yesterday. I didn't know I had it. The psychic looked at them. Where did you find it? In an old box. Who gave you the box? They thought for a moment. My family. The psychic went completely still. What? My family gave it to me years ago. Did you ever open it? No, why? I forgot about it. She pushed the envelope toward them. Open it. Their hands were shaking. Inside was a folded piece of paper. No name. No explanation. Only a date. They stared at it. The date was from years before you met. What does this mean? I don't know. Then why did you ask me to open it? Because the date matches something I saw last night. They looked up. What? The psychic opened her notebook. There it was. The same date. Exactly the same. A chill moved through the room. That can't be a coincidence. The psychic didn't answer. She turned another page. Tell me where you were on this date. I don't remember. Try. They closed their eyes. Nothing. Then a fragment appeared. A house. A hallway. A conversation. Someone arguing. A child standing nearby. They opened their eyes. I remember a house. Whose house? I don't know. Who was arguing? I can't remember. The psychic nodded. That's enough. How? Because your mind is protecting something. They frowned. Protecting me from what? From a memory you weren't ready to understand. The room became quiet. Then something unexpected happened. Their phone vibrated. A message. From the same person whose warnings had changed everything. They opened it. Why are you asking questions? Their heart dropped. They hadn't told anyone. They hadn't mentioned the psychic. They hadn't said anything about the old envelope. How do they know? The psychic looked at the message. They're watching the situation more closely than you realized. Another message arrived. Leave the past alone. They stared at the screen. Then another appeared. You don't know what you're opening. The psychic leaned forward. Don't reply. They looked at her. Why? Because they just confirmed something. What? They're afraid. Of what? The truth. For the first time, anger replaced fear. They typed a response. What are you hiding? The message was seen. No reply. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Then the phone rang. They answered. The voice on the other end sounded different. No confidence. No advice. Just fear. Stop digging. Tell me why. You don't understand. Then explain it. Silence. Tell me why you wanted me away from them. Still nothing. Then came the sentence they had never expected. Because I knew what would happen if you stayed. Their breathing became shallow. What would happen? The call ended. They stared at the screen. The psychic didn't react. She simply asked, do you understand now? No, they aren't afraid of your relationship. Then what are they afraid of? She looked at the old envelope. They're afraid you'll discover what happened before the relationship existed. That sentence changed the entire story. Because suddenly, the breakup wasn't the beginning. It was a consequence. Something had happened long before you met. Something that involved both families. Something that someone had spent years hiding. Jesus speaks, my child, there are moments when confusion feels safer than truth. But confusion keeps wounds open. When truth arrives, do not run from it. Let wisdom separate what was done to you from what you chose yourself. They looked at the psychic. What happened before we met? I don't have the full answer. You keep saying that. Because I won't lie to you just to give you a satisfying story. She paused. But I can show you where to look. She pointed toward the envelope. Read the back. They turned it over. There was handwriting. 3 words. Ask about him. They frowned. Who? The psychic shook her head. That is the question. They searched through old family records. Old photographs. Old documents. Nothing. Then they found a picture. It showed a group of people standing outside a house. They recognized one face. The person who had warned them about you. Their stomach dropped. Why are they here? The psychic took the photograph. She examined the background. Then she noticed something. A second person. Partially hidden behind the group. She enlarged the image. The face became clearer. It was someone connected to you. Someone you had mentioned once. Someone they had never considered important. The psychic whispered, this is the connection. What connection? These two people knew each other. They stared at the photograph. How? That is what we need to discover. They remembered a conversation from months earlier. You had once mentioned a family story. You had laughed about it. You said you didn't know whether it was true. You had forgotten the details. They had forgotten them too. Now those details suddenly mattered. They searched old messages between you. There it was. A sentence you had sent casually. My family has always been strange about that old story. They had never asked what you meant. Now they wished they had. They kept scrolling. Another message. I was told not to ask too many questions. The psychic looked at them. Read that again. They did. I was told not to ask too many questions. Who told you? They checked the conversation. You had never said. The message ended there. A missing piece. Another unanswered question. The psychic leaned back. Now you understand why this connection was difficult. They looked confused. Because of our families? Not exactly. Then what? Because someone knew your lives would eventually cross. They stared at her. That sounds impossible. Maybe. She paused. But the evidence keeps pointing in the same direction. Then she pulled out another card. She turned it over. Her expression changed immediately. What? She didn't answer. Tell me. She looked at them. This card represents hidden information returning at the exact moment someone is ready to face it. They almost laughed. That sounds convenient. It would be. She placed another card beside it. But this one doesn't. What does it mean? An old promise. They froze. What promise? I don't know. Then she turned over the final card. Her face became pale. What's wrong? She stared at the card. Then at the photograph. Then at the old envelope. These three things shouldn't connect. But they do. Yes. How? She whispered, someone made a promise years ago. What kind? To keep two people apart. Their heart stopped. Who? The psychic looked toward the photograph. The person you've been trusting. They couldn't speak. Everything suddenly made sense. The warnings. The secret messages. The strange interest in your relationship. The fear whenever your name was mentioned. But one question remained. Why would someone make that promise? The psychic stood. There's only one way to find out. Where are we going? She looked at the old photograph. To the place where this began. They followed her outside. Neither spoke during the journey. When they finally arrived, they recognized the building from their fragmented memory. The same hallway. The same doorway. The same place they had seen years ago without understanding it. Their hands began shaking. I've been here. The psychic nodded. You were supposed to forget. They stepped inside. Everything felt strangely familiar. A room. A window. An old wooden table. Then they noticed something carved into the wall. A date. The exact date from the envelope. They moved closer. Underneath it were two initials. One belonged to them. The other belonged to someone connected to you. Their heart stopped. How is that possible? The psychic didn't answer. She looked toward the doorway. Someone was standing there. The person they had been searching for. The one who had warned them. The one who had told them to stop asking questions. They looked terrified. You shouldn't have come here. They stepped forward. Tell me the truth. The person shook their head. You don't understand what you're about to uncover. Then explain it. I can't. Why? Because I promised. To whom? The person looked toward the photograph. Then whispered, to someone who isn't here anymore. Silence filled the room. They stared. Who? The person finally answered. And the name they gave was connected to your past. A name you had heard before. A name you had forgotten. A name that would explain why someone had spent years trying to keep your paths apart. But before they could ask another question, the person reached into their pocket. They pulled out an old photograph. Placed it on the table. And said, "You were never supposed to find this." The photograph showed two people. One from their past. One from yours. Standing together. Holding something between them. A document. And at the bottom of that document was a signature. Their signature. But the date was from before they had ever met you. They stared at it. This is impossible. The psychic stepped closer. Then she noticed one final detail. A second signature. Your name. Their entire body went cold. Because now there was no escaping the truth. Somehow, your name had been connected to theirs long before either of you knew the other existed. And the person standing across the room knew exactly why. They finally whispered, "You need to hear the whole story." Then the lights went out. The lights went out. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The room was completely dark. Then a door slammed somewhere in the building. They reached for their phone. The flashlight came on. The person standing across the room was gone. The old photograph was still on the table. So was the document. They picked it up. Their hands were trembling. Your name was written there. Their name was written beside it. And underneath both names was a date from years before you ever met. How? The psychic didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the doorway. Then she said, "We need to leave. Not until I know what this means." You don't understand. Then make me understand. She looked at the document again. This isn't proof that your relationship was predetermined. Then what is it? A connection existed before either of you knew about it. They stared at the page. Between our families? Yes. What kind? The psychic hesitated. That is what someone has spent years trying to hide. They stepped closer to the document. There was another line beneath the signatures. Almost impossible to read. They held the paper beneath the flashlight. The sentence became clearer. If they ever meet, the truth must remain buried. Their stomach dropped. Someone had anticipated that you might meet. Someone had feared it. Someone had made a plan. And suddenly, the entire relationship looked different. The warnings. The strange comments. The pressure. The unexplained distance. Maybe none of it had been random. The psychic looked at them. Do you remember what your family told you about this place? No, try. They closed their eyes. A memory surfaced. A voice. An argument. Someone saying, "Never bring this up again." Another voice answered, "They have a right to know." Then silence. They opened their eyes. I remember. What? There was an argument here. When? Years ago. Who was involved? They couldn't remember the faces. Only the voices. But one voice was unmistakable. The person who had tried to separate you. They stared at the psychic. They were here. Yes. Before I met them? Yes. The realization was overwhelming. They had assumed that person's involvement began when your relationship became serious. It hadn't. They had been connected to the story from the beginning. Perhaps even before you met. Jesus speaks, "My child, Hidden things may create confusion for a season, but truth has a way of returning when the heart is finally ready to face it. Do not fear what is uncovered. Fear only the decision to remain blind after seeing it. The psychic picked up the document. There is another page. They searched the room. A drawer. A cabinet. An old wooden box. Nothing. Then they noticed the table. One corner looked different. They pressed it. A hidden compartment opened. Inside was a second envelope. The psychic didn't touch it. You open it. They pulled it out. The envelope contained several handwritten pages. The first page began with a sentence that made their heart stop. If you are reading this, then they have finally met. They looked at the psychic. She said nothing. They continued. The writer explained that years earlier, two families had been connected through a serious conflict. One decision had created resentment. Another had created guilt. A promise had been made to keep the next generation away from the consequences. But there was something neither family had expected. The children would eventually cross paths. You and them. The writer had known this possibility. And they had warned someone to prevent it. Not because they believed you were dangerous. Because they were terrified that the old truth would surface. They turned the page. The next line was even more shocking. Their connection must not be allowed to expose what happened. Their breathing became unsteady. What happened? The psychic read the next page. Her expression changed. This isn't about a secret relationship. Then what is it? A betrayal. They stared at her. Whose? She looked at the document. Someone betrayed someone else years ago. Who? The answer wasn't there. The page had been torn. A piece was missing. They searched the envelope. Nothing. The psychic whispered, someone removed the most important part. They looked toward the doorway. The person who had disappeared. They suddenly understood. They took it. Probably. Then they know where the missing page is. Yes. I'm finding them. The psychic grabbed their arm. Wait. They turned. You cannot confront someone while you're this emotional. Why? Because they know more than you. That stopped them. What do you mean? They've had years to prepare for this. The words were chilling. Someone had been expecting the truth to surface. And perhaps that was why they had always tried to control the story. If they could control what you believed, they could control what you chose. They had never needed to force anyone. They only needed to influence the information. A warning here. A missing detail there. A carefully chosen lie. And the relationship would collapse naturally. That was much more effective than open confrontation. The psychic looked at them. Now you understand why forgetting was never the real solution. They nodded. They wanted me to forget. Exactly. But why? Because if you forgot the person, you would never investigate the connection. That sentence changed everything. The attempt to erase you wasn't only emotional. It was strategic. Someone wanted the relationship forgotten because the relationship itself was leading toward a hidden truth. They returned home. For hours, they searched old records. Family photographs. Letters. Messages. Anything connected to the date. Then they found something. A photograph from the same year. They zoomed in. You were not visible. Neither were they. But someone connected to you was standing beside the same person who had tried to interfere. Behind them was a familiar building. The same place. The same doorway. The same table. They stared at the image. Then noticed something in the corner. A handwritten note. They enlarged it. 3 words. Keep them apart. Their heart sank. There was no longer any doubt. Someone had intentionally interfered. But there was still a deeper question. Why were you involved? The next morning, they went back to the psychic. She had already discovered something. I found the missing name. Their eyes widened. Whose? She placed a paper on the table. Your name was written at the top. Underneath it was another name. Then another. A family connection. A chain of people. And at the bottom, the name of the person who had been manipulating the situation. They stared. They knew each other. Yes. How? The psychic answered carefully. Through something that happened before you were born. Silence. They felt the entire story shifting again. This wasn't simply about two people meeting. It was about two histories colliding. Two families. Two secrets. One connection. And someone who had been terrified of what would happen if the truth came out. Then the psychic said something unexpected. There is one more problem. What? The person you've been searching for isn't the one who started this. Their face changed. Who did? She pointed toward the old photograph. The person who made the original promise. Where are they? They're gone. Gone where? The psychic looked at them. They died years ago. Silence. Then how can we find the truth? You can't ask them. You've met them. When? Recently. Their mind raced. Then a memory surfaced. A brief encounter. A conversation. A person who had looked at them strangely when your name came up. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it felt terrifying. They immediately called that person. No answer. They tried again. Nothing. Then a message arrived. Don't ask questions about the past. Their heart began pounding. They typed, why? The reply came instantly. Because you are already involved. They froze. Another message appeared. You just don't know how. Then the phone went silent. They showed the psychic. She read the messages. For the first time, she looked genuinely disturbed. What? She pointed to the final line. Read it carefully. They did. You are already involved. Not, you were involved. Not, your family was involved. You. They were saying that the person sitting there had a direct connection to what happened. And then something even stranger appeared. A second message. Ask them what happened on the night you were born. Their face went pale. They looked at the psychic. What does my birth have to do with this? She didn't answer. Because at that moment, she noticed something written on the back of your photograph. A date. The same date. Their birth date. The room fell silent. Your photograph. Their birth date. The old document. The missing page. The family connection. Suddenly, the mystery became much darker. Because perhaps the person they had been trying to forget wasn't the only connection. Perhaps the two of you had been connected through a secret neither person had ever been told. The psychic whispered, now we are getting close. Close to what? The reason someone was terrified of you two discovering each other. They stared at her. And if we find it? She looked directly into their eyes. Then you may finally understand why they paid me to help them forget you. They froze. I never told you someone else paid you. The psychic's face went still. Neither person spoke. Because they suddenly realized something. The psychic had known from the beginning. This session hadn't been a random attempt to erase a memory. Someone had expected this investigation. Someone had been watching. And someone had deliberately sent them to this psychic, knowing exactly what she would uncover. The biggest question was no longer why they wanted to forget you. It was this: who wanted them to forget you in the first place? And what would happen when that person realized the truth was finally coming out? The psychic's last sentence stayed with them. Someone had sent them there. Someone had known what she would uncover. And suddenly, the entire session looked different. They picked up their phone. No new messages. No missed calls. Nothing. Then the screen lit up. An unknown number. One sentence appeared. Stop looking. Their heart raced. Another message followed. You were never supposed to know. They stared at the screen. For years, they had believed the greatest mistake was losing you. Now they realized something even bigger had been hidden. Someone had been controlling the story. Someone had decided what they were allowed to know. And someone had been terrified that the truth would bring you back into their life. They showed the psychic the messages. She didn't look surprised. Instead, she asked, "Are you ready to hear the part nobody wanted you to discover?" They nodded. The psychic opened the old notebook. This connection wasn't created by the people who tried to control it. She turned a page. They only tried to control what happened afterward. Another page. You and this person met because your lives eventually crossed naturally. Another page. But the history surrounding that meeting was hidden. They stared at her. What history? She placed the old photograph on the table. The betrayal. The room became silent. Years earlier, someone close to both families had made a decision. They had hidden the truth. They had changed a story. They had allowed one person to carry blame for something they hadn't done. And that lie eventually affected everyone who came afterward. The person who interfered with your relationship had discovered the truth. But instead of exposing it, they used it. They believed they could control the outcome. They thought separating you would prevent old wounds from reopening. Instead, they created new ones. The psychic looked directly at them. You were never the danger. They swallowed. Then what was? The truth. Jesus speaks, "My child, truth may disturb what has been carefully arranged, but it does not destroy what is genuine." Falsehood requires protection. Truth requires only courage. They remembered every moment when someone had warned them about you. Now they understood. Those warnings weren't based entirely on lies. That was why they had been convincing. There had been real pieces of history hidden inside them. But those pieces had been presented without context. The truth had been distorted. And they had made decisions based on incomplete information. That was the manipulation. They weren't told a completely false story. They were given enough truth to make the wrong conclusion. The realization broke something inside them. They whispered, "I blamed them." The psychic nodded. "You did. I thought they were the reason everything went wrong. They weren't." They looked at your photograph. For the first time, they understood how unfair it had been. You had probably spent months wondering why they changed. You had probably questioned yourself. Maybe you believed you weren't enough. Maybe you thought someone else was better. Maybe you thought they simply stopped caring. But the truth was different. They had been frightened, influenced, confused, and too proud to admit they didn't have the full story. They finally picked up their phone. Your old message was still there. The one they had never answered properly. They read it again. This time, they saw something they had missed. You had never demanded that they stay. You had simply asked them to be honest. That was all. And they couldn't even give you that. Their eyes filled with tears. The psychic remained silent. Then they asked, "Do you think they still care?" The psychic answered honestly, "I don't know what they feel today. They looked surprised. But I can tell you what matters. What? Whether they have peace. That question changed everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't about winning you back. It wasn't about proving the psychic right. It wasn't about destiny. It was about responsibility. If they reached out, it couldn't be to reopen an old wound just because they were lonely. It had to come from honesty. So they began writing. Not a dramatic confession. Not a message designed to make you miss them. Just the truth. I owe you an apology. They stopped. Then continued. I blamed you for things you didn't cause. Another sentence. I let other people's opinions affect how I treated you. Their hands shook. I was afraid to tell you what was really happening inside me. Then the hardest line. You deserved better than the version of me you received. They read the message. Deleted nothing. Added nothing. Then they sent it. For several minutes, there was no response. They didn't send another message. They didn't call. They waited. And somewhere else, your phone lit up. You saw their name. For a moment, you couldn't move. You opened the message. You read it once. Then again. A strange feeling came over you. Not excitement. Not anger. Something quieter. Relief. Because for so long, you had wondered whether you imagined the entire connection. Now someone was finally admitting that you hadn't. You hadn't been asking for too much. You hadn't misunderstood everything. You had simply been dealing with someone who was too afraid to tell you what was happening. And that knowledge gave you something you hadn't had in a long time. Closure. You didn't need to answer immediately. You didn't owe anyone forgiveness on demand. You didn't have to reopen the relationship. You simply allowed the truth to exist. And sometimes that is enough. Archangel Michael speaks, my child, never allow another person's return to become the condition of your healing. If they come back, let them come with truth. If they remain away, let your peace remain with you. Your future does not depend upon someone else's realization. The psychic closed her notebook. The session was over. But before they left, she said one final thing. You came here asking me to erase this person. They nodded. You thought forgetting would heal you. Another nod. But forgetting was never what you needed. They looked at her. What did I need? She smiled gently. To stop blaming yourself for a story you were never given all the pieces to understand. That sentence broke them. Because that was the deepest wound. Not losing you. Not the separation. Not the unanswered messages. They had spent years believing everything had happened because they weren't enough. Now they knew. They had made mistakes. They had caused pain. They had allowed fear to control them. But the entire ending hadn't been their fault. And it hadn't been yours either. There had been hidden information. There had been outside influence. There had been old wounds. There had been people making decisions from fear. Yet none of that changed the most important truth. They had still chosen how to treat you. And now they had to live honestly with that choice. They walked out of the psychic's room. This time, they didn't carry your photograph as something they wanted erased. They carried it as a reminder. Not of possession. Not of destiny. Of accountability. Because you had shown them something they couldn't see before. What happens when someone loves you but doesn't know how to receive love? What happens when fear becomes stronger than honesty? What happens when silence is chosen too many times? And what happens when someone finally understands the cost? They didn't know whether you would ever return. They didn't know whether you would answer. They didn't know whether the story had another chapter. And for the first time, they were willing to accept that. Because love isn't always proven by holding on. Sometimes it is proven by respecting the freedom of the person you hurt. That was the lesson they had been avoiding. The psychic hadn't given them a spell. She hadn't erased your memory. She had done something much harder. She had forced them to look at the truth. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. Now the final secret remained. Why had someone gone so far to separate you? The answer was simpler than the mystery made it seem. They were afraid of losing control. They believed that if you and this person discovered the old history, their own role would be exposed. They wanted to keep the past buried. But secrets don't disappear because people stop talking about them. They wait. They surface. They return through old photographs. Old messages. Forgotten conversations. Unexpected encounters. And sometimes, through the person you tried hardest to forget. That is why the attempt to erase you failed. Your memory wasn't the problem. The unresolved truth was. And when the truth finally came out, the memory lost its power to hurt. They could remember you without collapsing. They could think about you without trying to possess you. They could regret what happened without demanding that you fix it. That was growth. And perhaps that is the greatest twist of this entire story. The psychic never gave them what they paid for. They asked her to make you disappear. Instead, she helped them discover why they couldn't. They thought you were haunting them. You weren't. Their own unfinished choices were. They thought they needed to forget you. What they really needed was forgiveness. Not from you first. From themselves. Because carrying regret forever doesn't repair what happened. Changing does. And if you are watching this because someone once walked away from you, listen carefully. You don't have to wait for their apology. You don't have to wait for their realization. You don't have to wait for them to understand your value. You don't need their return to prove that you mattered. You mattered when they couldn't see it. You mattered when they were confused. You mattered when they walked away. You matter now. So protect your peace. Let the past teach you without allowing it to control you. If someone returns, watch their actions. If they apologize, let consistency prove the apology. If they ask for another chance, don't confuse regret with transformation. And if they never return, keep moving. Your future is still yours. Your story is still being written. Jesus speaks one final message: my child, do not chase what requires you to abandon your dignity. What belongs in your life will meet you with truth, not manipulation. Walk forward without bitterness. Keep your heart soft, but keep your wisdom awake. And Archangel Michael says, stand firm. You are not required to reopen every door that once closed. Some doors teach you. Some doors protect you. Some doors may open again only when both people have changed. Let discernment decide. So if this message touched something inside you, don't reveal your private story in the comments. Just write, I choose truth over confusion. Let those words be your declaration. Because the deepest revelation wasn't that they still loved you. It wasn't that they regretted losing you. It wasn't even that someone had influenced the separation. The real revelation was this: they tried to forget you because remembering you forced them to remember themselves. Every memory showed them what they had avoided. Every photograph reminded them of what they lost. Every unanswered question pointed toward the same truth. They had walked away from someone who wasn't asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. And they weren't ready. Maybe they are now. Maybe they aren't. That part belongs to their journey. Your journey is different. You don't need to stand still waiting for their courage. You don't need to prove that the connection was real. You don't need anyone's permission to heal. Take what was beautiful. Learn from what was painful. Release what was never yours to carry. And move forward. Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't getting someone back. Sometimes it is finally getting yourself back. And that was the one thing nobody could take from you. Not fear. Not manipulation. Not distance. Not silence. Not even the person who tried to forget you. They wanted your memory gone. Instead, the truth remained. And the truth was simple. You were never the person they needed to erase. You were the person they needed to understand. If this message found you at the right moment, don't ignore it. Red heart like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment, "I receive it," if you're ready to receive the blessing, healing, and love that is meant for you. Your comment may be the sign someone else needed to see today. Sparkles.